Doxa is probably best known for their colorful sub-collection. This collection of vintage-inspired divers are the most fun tool watches you can buy. The brand has built a strong reputation for reliability and innovation. Doxa's history dates back to 1889 when they originally made dress watches. The brand really didn't get big until about 80 years later when they shifted their focus to other types of timepieces. Back in the 1960s, Doxa started testing which dial colors would be the most visible in the murky lakes of Switzerland. The test concluded that orange was the most visible, and at Baselworld in 1967, they released the Sub 300 as their first dive watch. They were immediately popular because of their legibility, durability, and just generally being a good-looking timepiece. Doxa was growing in popularity rather quickly, but sadly it was short-lived. Like many watchmakers, they were hit hard by the quartz crisis. As an effort to offset some of the financial burden, Doxa joined a group of Swiss watchmakers to consolidate resources. This eventually failed, and Doxa, after being sold, ceased operations in about 1980. Then Doxa was bought by the Jenny Company in 1997, and in 2002 they relaunched their vintage designs and came back into the watch space almost like a micro brand. I own the Sub 200 in yellow, or should I say Divingstar. Doxa has names for all of their model colors. The orange is known as the Professional, the blue is the Caribbean, and the Tiffany blue is the Aquamarine. If those colors are a bit too loud for you, they do have the more subdued Shark Hunter and Sea Rambler. But I think part of the fun of owning this watch is all the different bright color options. The Doxa 200 is 42 millimeters, but because of the case thickness, lug-to-lug width, vintage design, and the beads of rice bracelet, I feel like I can get away with wearing it on my smaller wrist. If you're a bigger guy, just understand that this is going to wear smaller. The 300 is going to wear larger, but it is a completely different style. For me, the entry-level Doxa is perfect. This is the second vintage style diver I have owned, and lately, as the weather's been changing, I have been reaching for my Doxa a lot. The Sub 200 has an ETA 2824 movement, and I have no complaints. It's been pretty reliable, it's running within spec, and it's comparable to my Sellita-based movements. This is exactly what I would expect at this price point. It has decent water resistance and a screw-down crown. I, like many of you, don't go deep-sea scuba diving, so I just want to be able to swim with the watch. 200 meters of water resistance is plenty for me. The dial is yellow and I really love it. I have to show you this dial under a macro lens. It has this really interesting brushed, almost slate-like kind of texture to it. To the naked eye, it just gives the watch a nice matte finish. The Doxa is a tool watch. It has limited text on the dial and its design language is all about visibility. The dial features white hour markers with a thin black outline, a pencil-style handset, and a 3 o'clock date window. Something worth mentioning is they have done different lume designs on the hour hand versus the minute hand to help you differentiate in low light. That is, if you could actually see it. I appreciate the thought process behind this little detail, but the execution is very poor. Now we have come to the first thing I don't like about this watch. The lume on this watch is awful. Maybe it's not fair to compare it to the brilliant green of Seiko Lume Bright, but when compared to my Oris Aquis, which has similar blue, it's just dismal in comparison. It's not nearly as bright and doesn't last nearly as long. On all the places to cut corners on a dive watch, lume is a terrible idea. Supposedly there is some lume on the bezel, but I can barely see it. What's the point if it's barely visible? Speaking of the bezel, it's a sapphire insert. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with why the lume on the bezel is so awful, but otherwise the bezel looks fantastic in sunlight and you're gonna have a hell of a time scratching it. The Doxa has a domed sapphire crystal, which is supposed to resemble vintage acrylic. I like the domed crystal. It does add a little bit more height to the case, but the watch still remains relatively thin for a diver. It also makes the watch really pop in the sunlight. Now let's talk a little bit about the bracelet. There are some things I don't love about this bracelet, but there's a lot of good things about it too. It's a beads of rice bracelet, so each one of the individual steel links is going to have a lot of mobility, so it's very comfortable, and it also has enough space between each of the links that it's going to give you plenty of ventilation. It has a standard folding clasp that lays flat on my wrist with the Doxa logo. It also has a micro adjust. I really need to have a micro adjust because my wrist will swell a little bit in the summertime, and I like to wear my watches very tight. I don't want it to move around at all. The diver's extension is a little chintzy. It tends to rattle a bit. I tend to wear my watches fairly tight, so it hasn't been an issue for me, but when I'm fiddling around with the watch, I can definitely hear it. It does make an otherwise good bracelet seem cheap. I don't know what I expect at this price point, but I do expect a little bit better than this, and it's something to consider before purchasing the watch. They do offer the Doxa 200 on rubber straps that match the color of the dial. I can't speak to the comfort or durability of those straps because I have it on the bracelet. If any of you have this watch on a rubber strap, I would love to know what you think. I like the idea of a strap, but I just fear something that light in color would get dirty too easily. The Sub 200 may not have the impressive specs of some of the other models, but this vintage-inspired diver has a great look, combined with superior wearability. The brand may not have the richest heritage compared to some of its other Swiss competitors, but there's a reason that Doxa is still here today. The Sub 200 is entry-level, and there are some things about this watch that are very entry-level. But if you're looking for a solid tool watch that is really gonna stand out in a crowd and be an interesting conversation piece, then there could be room for the Doxa Sub 200 in your collection.